I think you guys have done this before, so let me just introduce Ira Winkler. I've known Ira for a long time. Ira is a well-known speaker, does a lot of keynotes at all the major conferences, and has been working with security awareness and lots of important topics, and I really value his opinion, and I hope you enjoy his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, wow, it works now. I'm supposed to talk until they get the volume right, but hopefully, anyway, I'm talking, the volume seems right, so it's a morning. I don't know if you've seen me present, but usually I start slow till I get in the groove and then I get going. But anyway, so this presentation is why your cybersecurity budget is a horse's ass. And the way this presentation came about was, like, I sit around with CISOs, like, you know, of course, none of the CISOs that are in this room. I sit around with a bunch of CISOs and I start thinking, my God, what a bunch of losers. I mean, there they are, and like I always hear them talking about how they're like trying to get their budget, how, oh, well, this is important, but you know, they're having budget cuts and I'm hoping to keep my budget. Everybody else will probably get a 10% cut. I'm hoping for a 7% cut. And I'm like, my God, you suck. I mean, I would cut your budget if I heard you complaining and I was your boss. And so with all that in mind, you know, I started looking at things. And, you know, a lot of this presentation, because I am using some stuff from my current company, so if it seems like a pitch, it might be a little bit of a pitch, I'm not going to lie to you. But at the same time, you could look at my book, Corporate Espionage, that I wrote in 1996, and all of these principles are pretty much in there, but, you know, now I have more of the mathematics to go ahead and do this. And actually, let me take a step back and talk about, just at a high level, this isn't necessarily in slides, but just at a high level, let's talk about machine learning, AI, and all that sort of stuff. AI is the most overhyped piece of garbage I've ever seen. And the reason is that it's kind of always been around, but now people are just starting to use it. And they're making like really, really hyped up and everything like that. And the reason I say this is that really at the end of the day, AI, but most of what we're doing is kind of what we would call machine learning. Because AI has a lot of different, you know, AI is the overarching umbrella that's supposed to make you think robots are going to take over the world. But the reality is that everything that we're implementing, mostly in cybersecurity, is machine learning. And machine learning is really just advanced mathematics that we haven't been able to use before. The same machine learning algorithms have been around for pretty much a couple decades, but now we're just starting to have the computing power to make use of it, because what we're doing at the end of the day is taking really, I guess, what would be referred to as big data, and nobody uses that term anymore despite it's still there. But now we can take big data, run a lot more complicated mathematical algorithms against big data, and at the end of the day, that's fundamentally what machine learning is. It's just kind of statistical algorithms that are a little bit more complicated. And, you know, I'll just make a pitch. Get advanced education, learn math, learn calculus, and a whole bunch of other stuff, because it's important. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today involves updates to the capabilities enabled by machine learning, because before, you can kind of make some calculations, but machine learning helps you make like more advanced calculations, taking in a lot more decision-making processes, taking in a lot more points of data and stuff like that. So anyway, that's my pitch for learning math and machine learning. So anyway, with that in mind, what was that? Okay. So let's talk about why your budget's a horse's ass. So how many people have seen the meme that goes around the internet every so often, how the space shuttle was designed based on the size of a horse's ass? If you haven't seen it, let me go into it, because it's kind of important. And actually, I did do fact-checking on this. I checked Snopes and checked their data and verified their data, and it's kind of true. Because what happened way back when people were starting, you know, transportation, everything obviously was moved around by horse. And like the Roman Empire, who built all the roads and everything like that, they had to standardize on something. And what happened was, you figure, okay, what's the most best way to move a lot of equipment? And you need horses pulling the equipment. Then if you have really heavy equipment, well, what do? String 3 or 4 horses like across? No. You had to pretty much go ahead and have the horses like 2 at a time, like sets of 2 in front of each other, because otherwise the roads were not going to be that wide. So anyway, what happened was as horses would walk, they obviously created ruts in the road. And when you want to figure out, well, how big do you make the carts behind them, they made the wheelbases essentially the size of how horses' hoof prints fit next to each other. And the reason is, again, they wanted the wheels to be within the ruts of the horses, the ruts created by the horses. Now, over time, even a chariot, which is designed to have 2 people, one standing next to each other, that was the same wheelbase as the carts that were made to have heavy equipment in them. And the reason was that they couldn't have some carts wider than other carts, because at the end of the day, what would happen is that would damage the carts, because you'd have some ruts that were 2 by 2 or whatever the case would be, and other ruts which were larger, and that would create lots of problems. So anyway, that kind of came up over time. So, sorry, I wish I had my clicker, but anyway, so that created the ruts in the road, and that's why to this day, we still have everything kind of like the same. And what happened was, once they started getting more advanced, because think about this, horse-drawn carts were in place from before the Roman Empire, all the way through a most common method of transportation, all the way through up until like when they invented the railroad. And even when they invented the railroad, how did it come about that it was so wide? What happened was the people who essentially made the carts for, horse-drawn carts also made the railroad cars, because those are the people that had the tooling to make the railroad cars. And what did they do? Did they want to reinvent everything? No, they essentially went ahead and took the same wheelbase and started to build railroad cars around it. Now, doing that created some limitations, because you can't make them too wide, because if you make them too wide, things can tip over. And then that also had an issue of, well, we can make it a certain width, but then there's also the height of it, because if it's too high, it might also go ahead and like sway the balance. Now, over time, that became the standardized width of railroads. I think it's 4 feet 8 inches is the standardized width of railroad tracks. And then you start to think, okay, now how did that impact things? Well, 4.8, and then it's a little wider because, obviously the cars have certain widths, but that became the standard. And then you stop and think, well, now we're designing trucks around it, because now we have containers. Containers go on railroad cars. The same containers go on ships that are stacked on ships. The same containers then get put on trucks, and our, tractor trailers are essentially designed around the same thing. So all modern traffic, all modern conveyance is based on this sizing. So when they have to start also transporting pieces of equipment, and pieces of equipment that might get assembled into other things, they have to basically have it designed so that they can the pieces can be transported by railroad tracks. So when you start to think, okay, how big can they make pieces of wood, like timber, logs, and stuff like that? That's limited by, again, size of a horse's ass and things. And, just to give you a modern equivalent, I know in Iowa you have snow, just like I do. I was in California. These people are like, what's snow? I don't get this. Because think about this when you're driving in snow. As the snow first goes down, you have to pretty much start to follow the car in front of you. Is that intentional? Not really. I prefer not to follow cars, that in like snow, so I don't like slide into them. But you follow the car in front of you because they kind of get the snow off the ground. They get you closer to the actual roadway. And then you follow them, and then another car follows them, another car follows them. So pretty much you can get down to the ground, or at least you're not going to be sliding around, because if you ever try to go outside of these tracks, you're going to veer off, you're going to start slipping anytime you go out. So this is kind of the modern day analogy. Now, while the space shuttle, maybe there's a couple parts that have to fit on, railroad cars and stuff. The Minuteman missile actually does fit on railroad cars. So nuclear missiles, warheads, pieces of equipment are designed essentially based on a horse's ass, because they have to go ahead and fit on the same dimensions that were created, not not even decades, not even centuries, but eons or millenniums. So think about this. And now, the reason I start saying this, and there, you know, I'm an analogy type of person. So let me ask you this question. How many of you are, like, know your company right now is creating your cybersecurity budget? So many of you are doing it firsthand. The others of you are involved in one way or another, probably. And where do they start with the cybersecurity budget that you're creating for next year? And with any rare exception, you first take a look, okay, what's my budget this year? Now I know what my budget this year. Well, can I ask for more? Can I hope not to be cut? If I ask for more, what should I ask for? How much can I get? It's like maybe I can get like a 5% increase or something like that. And then that's how you got your budget this year. Does it make any logical sense for what you actually need? Not really. You're just trying to take what you got, hope you don't lose money, and maybe try to get something better. Now, how was this year's budget created last year? When you start to think about it, the budget this year was created from fundamentally the base. It was the budget last year with maybe a little bit of changes. Then the budget the year before that, the budget the year before that was created the budget the year before that, and so on and so on and so on. And I haven't heard anybody yet that tells me that's not how they do it in their own organization. Everybody pretty much does it. And I would argue today that most organizations have a cybersecurity budget that's probably based on something 2 decades old, with some modifications. Maybe if there was a major incident, they had some, you know, kind of big change. Maybe if a regulation came in, like when PCI came out and a whole bunch of other stuff, maybe if you're involved in the European Union, GDPR. But all of your budgets are pretty much based on some obscure budget you had nothing to do with and will likely happen before the company. Now, at the same time, what's the sanity check for your budget? The sanity check, for some reason, tends to be what percentage of the IT budget is IT security. I've been sitting in, even when I was at Walmart, I sat in, like, because we obviously had to have a cyber insurance of one form or another, despite the fact, obviously, we're self-insuring to a limit. And they even asked us, what percentage of the IT budget is IT security? We gave them a number, and then it's like, oh, okay. I'm like, this is your answer to, like, that makes sense? And I'm sitting here thinking, why does that make sense? And it really doesn't, because stop and think about this. And one organization I think has it a different way, for example, is a company like Capital One, the large banks. And the reason is, stop and think, because now I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson and tell you how old I am. Before, like, the 1980s, like in the 1980s, information systems were managed and budgeted based upon the principle of the management of information systems. Management of information systems was the concept, well, my computers are worth the hardware, the software, what's the people worth, you know, what are the facilities, and so on. And you had a director of IT who reported to the chief financial officer, and the chief financial officer ran all the information technology resources because they just considered that a financial expense and therefore was run by the CFO. Then around the 1990s, somebody wrote a paper in Harvard Business Review or something like that, and they wrote a paper called Information Resource Management. And what happened there was they said, oh, you know, if the computers go down, and they love to use the American Airlines Sabre system that made airline reservations and is around in one form or another to this day. And they would say, hey, you know what? If that Sabre system goes down, we still have all our hardware, we still have all our software, we still have all our people, but we're losing tens of millions of dollars an hour. Maybe it's not the computers that have value, maybe it's the value of the information and services provided by the computer that have value. So what we're going to do is we're going to say our information technology has intrinsic value, and now we're going to create the position of a CIO, Chief Information Officer, who's on equal footing as a Chief Financial Officer, because our computers are as valuable as our money, and then we're going to manage it under the concept of the information resource management principles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, even to this day, 3 decades after information resource management came out, even after the Chief Information Officer CIO position exists, we're still asking a question like, what percentage of the IT budget should IT security be? So what are they doing? They're basing IT security on the value of the hardware, software, people. They're not basing it on the value of the information and services. We're 4 decades behind where we should be. The reality is that you look at a company like a Capital One or some other large bank, and their budgets are going to be like billions of dollars, which is kind of possibly maybe good or bad. It's within 10% of the IT budget or whatever it is. But the reality is they don't say, I'm protecting the $10 billion of computers. They say, I'm protecting trillions of dollars of transactions that go through our systems on a daily basis. And so they value their information security program on trillions of dollars of transactions, not on the cost of a couple of mainframe computers, which is how other people are doing it. But right now, the logic, the sanity we're using is, okay, we have a budget based on a horse's ass decades ago, while we're also doing the sanity check on what percentage of IT. This is not how it should be. So anyway, you know, what can we learn? Going back to the horse's ass example. Fundamentally, it's easy to perpetuate things year after year after year after year. And they still keep following everybody's asses, you know, from one year to the next. It's not better, it's just easier. Stop and think if you had to go back and rationalize your budget each year based upon the current threats, the current technologies, and everything else that you face. Most people don't know how to do that. So what do? They go ahead and they say, well, it's just easier to say, here's what I have, let me get a little bit more and so on and see what I can get. And then it removes the need to think and experiment, in all honesty. That's not a good thing. You know, all advances are limited by the ruts in the road, and any attempts to deviate essentially create problems, because stop and think, you know, if you're taking a cart down a road and all of a sudden you have like one wheel in the rut, another wheel out of the rut because you decide I want a wider cart, you know, that wheelbase is gonna get damaged. The wheel's gonna go in, it's gonna go out, the goods on top of it aren't gonna be flat and everything, and it's gonna create damage over time. So it limits what you can do. Maybe somebody said, hey, maybe instead of horses, we use cows or something. You know, but, you know, anyway, and that would have a different dimension. So here's where I came up with the phrase, because this is the biggest problem, and I wrote about this in 1996. The biggest problem in cybersecurity then, and it still is now, is that CISOs are getting the budgets they deserve, not the budgets that they need. And they fundamentally need to learn how to deserve the budgets that they need. Because all they're doing right now is like, please give me money. You know, it's kind of like the scene in Oliver. Wow, now I'm really dating myself. You know, please, sir, may I have some more? You know, you got to stop that. You got to start thinking logic. You got to start thinking business practices and so on. So I already mentioned the budget came from last year. And again, obviously it doesn't make any sense at all. But why the difference? And the difference is that fundamentally, while we talk about, oh, we don't want a CISO to have an MBA, we don't want a CISO from the business, that's not necessarily a good thing. I'm not saying we want somebody who's like a clueless business person who doesn't understand the fundamental principles of cybersecurity, technology, and so on. But at the same time, the problem we get from that is we don't know how to negotiate against the other departments. We don't know how to walk into board meetings or budget meetings and make business cases saying, here's the return on investment, here's the business case for this, and so on. And this is where we're kind of suffering. We don't know how to compile metrics of incidents, accurate metrics of incidents. We don't know how to compile metrics of non-incidents. Because, you know, fundamentally, everybody says the problem with cybersecurity is if you do it well, nothing happens. And in large cases, that's true. That, however, doesn't mean people in history have not been able to figure out what's the return on investment of non-incidents happening. The problem, again, is in cybersecurity, we think we're these special snowflakes where we have all these unique things that nobody ever has to deal with anything like this. You know, like, for example, we are the only profession that has to deal with human error. Nobody else in the course of human events has ever had to deal with a person doing something they're not supposed to do. But somehow we have to come down, and we are that special snowflake that has that unique problem of humans being fundamentally flawed. So But here's the thing, other disciplines have learned to deal with this, and we're not learning from these other disciplines, and this is a big problem. So for example, operations, if a COO wants to create a new factory, says, look, we need to retool our factory, I'm just making this up, from having gas-powered engines to electric vehicles. If we're going to go ahead and start to work that, what do? They say, okay, our factory fundamentally is going to be shut down. That's going to cost us X amount of money. We're not going to be producing cars. We're going to have to spend this much money on new equipment. We're going to have to spend that much on the installation of the equipment. We're going to have to retrain our people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is how much money it's going to cost. And then they go back and say, okay, but with the move to electric vehicles, we're going to get government incentives. We're going to have a larger market base. We're going to have this. We're going to have increased efficiency. And they say the return on investment is going to be this. And over the course of 5.7 years, we will recover the money by taking down a factory for a period of time and retooling it. That's how they do that. Another principle, accounting. If there ever was a discipline that had to deal with human error, it's accounting. Much more than cybersecurity, because all that has to happen is one person makes an error or whatever. The accountants know, okay, here's the amount of money going through our systems, here's the amount of fraud we have. If we can tweak our system to go ahead and account for fraud, there will be this return on investment. Maybe that money is like, look, we're going to have some fraud, like, for example, credit card fraud. How much credit card fraud is acceptable? Well, if we have that, we'll just increase the interest rates by this amount of money, and so on. That's how other disciplines, safety science, much more, very much in line with cybersecurity. They know, for example, how much an injury or death costs in a workplace. And fundamentally, they're like, okay, if somebody gets injured in the workplace, the factory might be shut down for a period of time until we figure out why the injury occurred, what can happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's how much money it costs. If we go ahead, the potential fix for this is to go ahead and make sure the people are, like, properly trained. There's going to be downtime, whatever. We're going to have to change the workflow, and, because in cybersecurity, we think, oh, just tell people not to do that, and they won't. In safety science, they think, we'll just change the workflow. We got to learn lessons from that, and they know how much it's going to cost and what the return on investment is going to be. In cybersecurity, we're not making the same fundamental mathematical arguments everybody else is. So anyway, to start making these type of arguments, you have to understand the concept of risk. How many of you are security people? Okay, pretty much you're all failures. Because the definition of security is being free from risk. By definition, if you're a security expert, you're a failure, because you're never going to be free from risk. Our job in the security profession, as we call it, is to be risk managers. How can we go ahead and essentially, I'm going to use the word optimize, the amount of loss that we have based upon the resources that we have? That's our job. How do we manage risk? I'm not going to ask this question, but once, I frequently ask the audience, what's perfect security? And somebody will always give me an answer that's in one form or another. Take the computer, put it in a block of cement, and throw it in the ocean. And I'm like, congratulations, that's an awesome denial of service attack. And, it's like, is the data secure? Well, it kind of is, but it's not available. That's a problem. We have to put our organizations at risk, and we have to figure out how to manage the risk. So in order to manage it, we got to figure out, okay, what is risk? And we don't understand that well. So risk is value. The line should end here, but I don't know how to work Microsoft Equation Manager, so that's on me. But anyway, just think value is outside of this. Value is pretty much cyber risk quantification, as they call it. What are our information services worth? What is there to lose? Then you have threat vulnerability. Threat is the who or what that's out to get you. You could have things, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, snowfall, things like that, natural disasters. Then you also have the people. You have your users, which are your biggest problem frequently. Well-meaning users are like the biggest threat. Then you have nation state. You have external hackers, internal, things like that. Those are all threats. Threats by themselves are completely irrelevant. What's relevant at the same time are vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are the weaknesses that allow the threat to exploit you. If you have no vulnerabilities, then it doesn't matter. You have no risk. Likewise, if you have no threat, you have no risk. The reality is you're going to have both threat and risk. Then what do you do to mitigate that? You have countermeasures. Countermeasures can either mitigate the threat or mitigate the vulnerability. Now, in reality, it's hard to mitigate the threat. You're not going to stop a hurricane, earthquake, a flood, or whatever from existing. That's kind of impossible. What you can do is you can stop the vulnerabilities from existing in theory. So, for example, you don't have to put a data center in Houston, Texas that gets major hurricanes and flooding on a regular basis. You don't have to go ahead and put like something in like major snowfall areas and things like that. You can go ahead and mitigate the vulnerability. So essentially, when you start thinking about it, the real definition of a cybersecurity program is the implementation of countermeasures to mitigate the vulnerabilities most likely to be exploited by the threat that are going to cause you significant losses. And when you could start to realize that is the fundamental nature of a corporate cybersecurity program, then you could start to actually do something useful about it. But the concept is the risk should be monetary. It shouldn't be like, well, we don't want hackers to hurt us. It's like, well, what are they going to do? That's the key question. So anyway, here's the concept. And again, I have this slide or diagram in one form or another in every book I ever wrote since 1996. So anyway, here's the concept, what I call optimized risk. So fundamentally, what this represents is when you have nothing from the beginning, the first thing you have are your countermeasures are at zero, your vulnerabilities are at the maximum. Everything below the red line represents potential loss. What is the risk, what is the nature of the risk that you face? As you start to increase your countermeasures, you should start to have a decrease in your vulnerabilities and therefore your potential loss. Now, at some point, everybody's like, okay, so what you're saying is I want to be over here. I want my vulnerabilities to be as low as possible. I'm like, no, that's stupid, because then the cost of your countermeasures are more than you're going to, like your security program is your biggest loss. So they're like, oh, so maybe I should go here where it intersects? I go, no. That means that you plan to spend exactly the same amount of money you're going to lose. In reality, what I tell them, you want to figure out what is the point, what is the amount of risk you're willing to take, and what countermeasures are going to get you there. And there should be a reasonable gap between there. What the reasonable gap is, not really sure, but it should be pretty significant, because the likelihood of losing everything is kind of, I'm not going to say impossible, but it's pretty small. So you want to go ahead and say, okay, what is the optimal amount I'm willing to lose or willing to place at risk, and then figure out how am I going to get there. Now, the reality of how we currently do this, however, is we're given an arbitrary budget that somehow is rationalized by decades before budgeting processes and a sanity check of what percentage of the IT budget. And what you want to do is, what you're doing now is you're figuring out, I have a budget, the maximum countermeasures I get is that, and then I have an arbitrary reduction of risk. What is this arbitrary reduction of risk? You frankly have absolutely no clue. All you know is you're spending this amount of money on this amount of countermeasures, and you have no idea where you are. And that's why nobody takes us seriously. How you should be done is figure out, okay, what is the defined amount of acceptable risk that I get? What are the required countermeasures that are going to get me there? And then what's the budget that's going to get me to that amount of countermeasures? That is how you should rationally base your cybersecurity programs. But it's not how we do this. Anyway, so how would I recommend you do this in theory? Is you figure out, because again, thinking at a high level, kind of hard, but figuring it out tactically, say, okay, what is the countermeasure that's going to give me the highest return on investment? So you say, okay, I'll start with that. Then you go, what's the next countermeasure that gets me the next highest return on investment? And so on and so on and so on. And then at some point you figure out, okay, let me stop here. And then when you get there, you figure out, wait a second, okay, I'm going to be possibly at a little bit more expense than I might otherwise be, but I'm going to still have a very significant decrease in the reduction of potential loss. And so this is what you're doing, because you're thinking if you do this intentionally, you will have a much more intentional cybersecurity program. And it's based, again, on the possible, what is the cost of a vulnerability and what's the cost of a countermeasure. And that's how you should do it, in my opinion, in the ideal world. So anyway, breaking it down just to talk about it, I went through a lot of this threat probability, yada, yada, yada. So anyway, how do you determine potential loss? You know, this is cyber risk quantification. You start figuring out the hard and soft costs. Obviously, if there's a theft of some sort, that's a hard cost. If there's fines, that's a hard cost. On the other hand, if you have loss of reputation, that is generally considered a soft cost, but that's a problem. Difficulty recruiting people, that's probably a problem, but you have a hard time, again, coming up with a hard number for it. You have data breach cost, the investigation recovery. There's a whole thing, what's the latest incident? It's like they're saying $25 million on not Target, but some other company that just had some loss. It wasn't, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but you know, right now, for example, MGM, anyway, we'll see if this works. But anyway, MGM, for example, now has other costs associated with their thing, and they're trying to figure it out and so on. But anyway, then you have variable factors. Variable factors would include something, for example, like geographies. So, for example, if you're operating in Europe compared to just the United States, people operating in Europe, Meta was just fined 1.3 billion euros or something like that for GDPR regulations. And GDPR regulations have some serious fines associated with it. You might be operating in some environments that really don't care, and things like that. You might be operating in China. China in and of itself might not necessarily be a threat. You can get away with a lot there. At the same time, if China ever gets mad at the US, all of a sudden they could do like things that would impact you. Sorry, I can't mention the Walmart incident, but it wasn't a problem with Walmart. It was just like Walmart, you know, China was mad at Walmart because we would not violate U.S. trade restrictions because, you know, Walmart wouldn't take goods and services that were manufactured where slave labor was being used and so on. You know, and they didn't like the fact we stuck with those laws. But anyway, different things, legal environments, company sizes, industries. If you have an incident history, you know, frankly, you know, if criminals know that they, for example, hacked you before and they were successful and they made a lot of money, they're going to hack you again. And if it comes public, another group will hack you and so on. So anyway, those are things that happen. You know, the viability of your cybersecurity and risk programs. Anyway, now there's a concept where everybody, I talk to people when I start mentioning this, and they're like, okay, should I figure this out system by system, or should I, you know, do it overall? Because, you know, it might make sense. Like, so for example, if you could figure this type of stuff out system by system, you would say, okay, that computer is really, really valuable, so I should start there when I start implementing patches. And that kind of makes sense. The reality is to do cyber risk quantification at that level is really, really, really hard. And despite the best mathematics, you can try it, but my recommendation is to start with the overall picture, not trying to work down, you know, look at the forest, not each and every tree in there. Because otherwise, you know, if you're an organization with tens of thousands of computers, that's one thing. If you're an organization with millions, that's something completely different. So anyway, consider that. Then there's obtaining value. How do you get the hard numbers, like I mentioned, the cyber risk quantification? Now, you could go to your CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, might have done some studies. You might hire organizations like McKinsey or Deloitte or whatever that have cyber risk quantification programs. And those programs can come up with some decently accurate numbers, but they take 9 months and a couple $1 million to figure out those things. So maybe that's a concern. Then you have industry incidents you could possibly use. So for example, if you're in the, I hate to say it because I'm really bothered by this, by pointing this out. But both Caesars and, so, you know, if you look at Caesars and you look at MGM, Caesars paid $25 million in ransomware, MGM did not. MGM lost hundreds of millions of dollars while Caesars lost 25 million and a little bit of self-respect, and they went on. So you got to start looking at something like that and saying, hey, what is the right number here for a possible ransomware incident and so on. And then you have insurance data. If you can take insurance data from like the resellers, the actuaries and stuff like that, they have some really accurate numbers, but you have to put that data, again, through some machine learning programs, because you have to take into account, okay, here's the normalized data, but now I have an organization that's of that size compared to that size and so on. So how does this impact me? This is why I recommend you kind of learn the, you know, at least machine learning 101 or data science, data mining, whatever you want to call it. Then you have third-party tools. This is cyber risk quantification tools. I'll give you a warning here. Obviously, I have a bias. Part of what my company does is cyber risk quantification, so I know an awful lot about this. But some of these third-party systems are accurate. Some are completely off. Some give hard mathematical figures, dollar figures that may or may not make sense. Some just give you an index score, like your cyber risk has gone down from a 7.2 to a 7.0. Like, oh, I feel so much better now. You know, I don't like that. You know, it's giving you an arbitrary number. So it doesn't really make sense. But you can start looking at these tools, but figure out which ones are more accurate, if they're going to give you real-time data and data representing actual things going on in your company, vice historical data that they give you once a quarter or something like that. Now let's talk about probability. Probability is essentially what's the likelihood threats are going to exploit the vulnerabilities. That is, that at the end of the day, that's it. So you have to look at all the potential threat actors that are out there. The threat actors can go ahead and be, like I mentioned before, external, internal. They could be nation state. I mean, North Korea's entire economy, a lot of people don't realize this, but the entire North Korea economy these days is pretty much based on cybercrime. They're making a lot of the money for their economy by going ahead and hacking like the Bank of Bangladesh and everything for, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars and things like that. But that's a major thing. You know, you have well-meaning employees causing damage, other people. And then also, it's hard to say where, you know, where I would put dark web data and things like that. Because when I've investigated incidents, there are sometimes where we have to go online on the dark web and we see if there, for example, if that one of the victims has credentials that are still up on the dark web, and then we have to buy the credentials back from the dark web, because usually if you buy them, they do take them down and keep them down. So we're trying to decrease the risk there. But if you have that data on the dark web, that becomes a serious problem. That, you know, it makes you more likely to be exploited if people are given like a key directly into your environment. So you have to start looking at that. I also want to, I didn't make this distinction before, but there's the difference between, I don't have a laser pointer. There's a difference between malicious threats and malignant threats, and we totally undervalue malignant threats. And I'll give you the best example. Right after 9/11, people were saying, like, all of a sudden Homeland Security said, we got to take the numbers off the side of railroad cars because those numbers indicate what's inside each of the tanker cars. And if a terrorist sees that there's like a dangerous chemical inside a tanker car, it's going to be a big problem. They'll know to attack their tanker car. And then they started doing that. And then the first responders say, no, 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 you can't do that, because your mythical terrorist attack might likely never occur, and even if it occurs once. However, railroad car derailments occur on a daily basis, and we need to know immediately whether or not there's a dangerous chemical in these cars, which happen on a daily basis. That's the malignant threat, the things that happen all the time that are not intentional but just happen. So keep that in mind. Don't underestimate malignant threats. You know, it's like, don't underestimate like somebody catching a cold for a cyber biochemical attack or something like that. So anyway, then you have your vulnerabilities. Your vulnerabilities are your attack surface, you know, attack surface management, things like that. You know, they could be technical, operational, physical, or personnel types of vulnerabilities, and so on. And then you got to start to consider what's the probability of the threats and vulnerabilities coming after you. And at the end of the day, you have to start looking at the skill level of a threat. The skill level of the threat can vary. You know, obviously you have a disgruntled employee, they have one level of, you know, skill level, or you could have like the North Korean hackers that have another skill level. And if you know you're being potentially targeted by one versus another, you know you have an issue. Likewise, if there's data on the dark web creates a lot of serious issues that you got to start to account for. Because if all of a sudden, like let's say a new Log4j comes out, If a new log4j comes out, you're possibly screwed. If there's a proof of concept for a zero-day vulnerability, you're possibly screwed. That turns your whole risk, calculations completely on their head. On the other hand, if somebody says, well, there's kind of a zero-day, but we're not going to tell you how to do it, I hate to say it, but you don't want to discount a possible zero-day, but you have to take into account the real-world checks and balances that you have, because you have to figure out how to balance limited resources against your real threats. Anyway, here's how I start to calculate, how you do things. This is from my company's type of stuff, but anyway, you have to look at your threat source. You have to look at the assets that they could potentially get to. And then if you could start doing attack path visualization, you could start to see how can a threat get to your data. And now why is this important? Because you could have all these vulnerabilities that have all these different criticalities, but the reality is if they're not used in an attack path, they're irrelevant to how a bad person will exploit you. I'm not saying you want them to exist if you can't, if you can mitigate that, but when you start to prioritize things, you have to figure out, okay, which vulnerabilities are actually potentially going to cause me some harm. And some are more likely than others, especially if they're in a given attack path. And when you could start to see that, you can start to see, you know what? And then do some simulations like Monte Carlo simulations and a variety of other sort of mathematics, which is why I started with this. You can start to see the probabilities of a given vulnerability being exploited. And yes, at the end of the day, you want to figure out how can I stop everything here? But the reality is you probably don't have the resources to stop everything. You want to figure out what are the best resources to stop the attack's impossible progress. So anyway, when you start to look at this, and you can't see it from the back, I'm pretty sure, but if this has a 94% of exploitation on that one, that means that there's a high likelihood that somebody's possibly going to exploit that. At the same time, if you can mitigate the attack paths by taking down one link, so for example, 48%, this one just says password reuse as an example, if you could take this off, a lot of the other vulnerabilities are not going to go ahead and be able to be exploited. So this might become more of a critical area to stop and so on. So again, taking into account mathematics, you can start to see, okay, yes, I have some vulnerabilities that they say are critical, but which ones are actually going to be exploited? What's the potential value in mitigating them? And maybe I could stop a whole bunch of vulnerabilities by stopping one. Again, if you could get people to a choke point, you can stop a lot of things. How much time do I have? Okay, I have enough. Anyway, so how do you determine vulnerability costs? Again, once you figure out the vulnerabilities and what are the physical assets a vulnerability could lead to, you could go ahead and say the probability of the vulnerability exploited, and then sum up all of the assets that it could possibly touch. That tells you mathematically what is the cost of any potential vulnerability that's within your environment. So that way you can say, hey, this vulnerability can cost me $38 million. And then figure out, okay, if that vulnerability costs me $38 million, is it worth actually mitigating? And then you could say, probably. On the other hand, if it means redesigning your whole network, like I had one case, unfortunately, where we were investigating, like China basically pretty much controlled a Fortune 50 type of company. And they're like, how do we get rid of them? And because of the way the malware was at the time, we were like, got to kind of rip out your whole network and reconfigure it. They're like, not going to happen. They're like, what's the cost of China staying in? Unfortunately, the cost of China staying in was helping the company, because the CISO said the way I found out they were inside my company was because they were administering our systems better than the admins were. Because China had to literally upgrade the software on a bunch of computers because their spyware essentially needed the latest version of an operating system, and they literally decided to upgrade it because they saw the company was doing nothing about all the other stuff they were doing. So they were brazen enough to upgrade the operating systems to install so that they can run their new type of spyware. And then it was like, how much is your intellectual property worth you're being screwed for? And he's like, nobody's going to give me the money to redo the whole network. And they decided to live with it for a while. So anyway, then we have the cost of countermeasures. And, when you start figuring this out, like I started to mention, is a countermeasure worth the cost to mitigation? You know, I'm a big fan of multi-factor authentication, not because Sista does rap songs about it, but because multi-factor authentication, while not perfect, does have a real, does make it exponentially more difficult to exploit things. So anyway, if you implement multi-factor authentication for like $500,000 for an organization, yes, I know it's like $3 million, depend for most, but you implement multi-factor authentication and you're going to be able to say, look, multi-factor authentication is going to cost $3 million, but the type of incidents we're suffering because of lack of multi-factor authentication are costing us $178 million. That means that's pretty good return on investment, and you should start to make the case for having money for that. Not going ahead and say, well, maybe if I have money left over from last year's budget, maybe I'll do it. You make the proactive case to say, if you give me $3 million, I will return an investment of $175 million. The 178 minus 3 as an example. So anyway, you have to do that by including all the costs, like the price, people, maintenance, geographies, and then also consider that one countermeasure might be able to be a choke point. One countermeasure might be able to stop a whole bunch of, multiple types of attacks against multiple assets, and those are things to consider when you're calculating return on investment. So then you prioritize. I like to start people prioritizing based on choke points, because it's a really easy and blatant place to start. Then there's the high return on investment countermeasures that if you can identify mathematically are good for you. Then quick wins. Sometimes if you don't have a lot of budget, sometimes you're trying to get more and get support. Figure out which type of wins you can get that require relatively low effort and relatively low cost. And then there are some countermeasures. You might have limited resources at the end of the year, and you figure out which countermeasures cost me the least but will give me the highest return on investment. Anyway, going back, the reason I put this up again is, showing, for example, choke points. Like if you're concerned about supply chain attacks, you can figure out where along this supply chain path might be the most inexpensive place to mitigate a potential attack. So you're pretty much eliminating a given threat from exploiting any part of your organization. This does take a little bit more than one line, I'm not going to lie, but think about that as you start to move forward. So when you put it together, here's the concept, and fundamentally, you got to start to deserve what you need. You can't be one of those losers I keep seeing again and again and again. It's like, well, here's my budget last year. I need more money because everybody else, all my friends are getting more money, so I should get more money too. You got to start going ahead and making the business case for it, that if you give me X amount of money, I will return Y for that amount of money. Make the business case like every other discipline inside your company does. And if you don't have that understanding, hire a consultant, go to your CFO, learn how to make better business cases. If you need to highlight recent lawsuits, you can highlight pretty much other losses. All you have to do is do a Google search, and you'll find just about a dozen companies in any given industry that have suffered some form of loss that you can point your bosses to get and deserve the money. And, oh yeah, so I'll tell a quick story. I don't know how many people know Dan Meacham, but Dan is currently CISO of Legendary Entertainment Movie Company. And Dan used to be CISO of Aramark up in Philadelphia. And one time I was giving a presentation, and this was probably about a decade and a half ago, and Dan pulls me aside. He's like, Ira, let me show you my iPad. And I'm like, I know what an iPad looks like. He's like, it's not the iPad, it's the app, you idiot. And anyway, so I open up the thing, and he goes, okay, look at this. And he's like, I walk into my board meetings, and I say, here's the money I need. Then they say, okay, well, if I ask for $80 million, they'll come back with 65 or something like that. So I say, hold on a second. I open up my app. I go 80, and then I go 65. I enter that data. And then I go back to them, and I show them a graph which says, okay, to save $15 million, it's going to increase our exposure by $279.3 million. And all I need you to do is sign here, because the next part of the app was a signature page that pretty much printed out a formal letter that says to save $15 million in cybersecurity budget, you're going to have a $279.3 million increase in exposure. And he just says, please sign here so I can document I did my job and told you what it was. Dan usually got his money. Now, I'm pretty sure to this day that that was a random number generator, but it worked. And that's what matters. He was able to go in with a cost benefit for what he was asking for. And even, frankly, I'm pretty sure he never got everything he was asking for, but they at least knew that he was going in there with some form of background support on why he wanted his money. So he was able to deserve what he needed a decade and a half ago, and he's probably still doing it. Well, he is still doing it to this day because I spoke to him earlier this. Anyway, so how do you optimize your cyber risk investment? Again, in the ideal world, go ahead, figure out the cost of return on investment and what a countermeasure is going to return for you. And again, ideally, you're going to have a significantly reduced risk budget. Deserve what you need. Make sure, again, every countermeasure has a return ROI. Present your cybersecurity budget as having a risk reduction. I don't want you walking in as losers, because I see too many CISOs that think that they are a cost, they're not a return. They think that somehow, well, gee, I know I cost the company money, but please give me some more because I'll be better at it. No, you have to understand, you provide a return on investment. Just imagine an e-commerce company that is not able to secure transactions. You would be out of business. Just imagine any company that has customer data, a healthcare or hospital company, which frankly really, they're kind of one of the worst out there in keeping cybersecurity. But just imagine how well a hospital is going to do if they keep being taken down by ransomware incidents. And you've got to understand that as a profession, we are now not a cost center, we're an enablement center. And you people have to be able to go ahead and say, I'm sorry I cost you like $70 million and I really apologize for that. You got to go in there with confidence and say, yeah, my budget's $70 million, but I return $3.8 billion every year for you. And you got to start walking in with what is the return on investment, not the loser who walks in there thinking, I'm sorry I cost you so much money. So anyway, buy my books, they're awesome. And anyway, I have 2 minutes if there's questions. Okay, since there's not questions, you now have 1.5 minutes of your time back. Thanks.